Julie and John Gottman, this is a wonderful opportunity, and thank you so much for joining us here on In Conversations with Dear Me. I've been waiting for this for quite some time, this opportunity. I'm so glad it's come this way. Thank you so much for joining us here from your wonderful studios in
You're welcome.
Where are you actually?
We are actually in our studio in Portland, Oregon. So we have moved to Portland, Richard, because we have a grandchild for the first time. And we're ecstatic and living in Portland to help support the family.
That's wonderful. I'll tell you, it's fabulous. We had a seventh birthday of our granddaughter, and we have and son one day a week. He's 2. And we've just got another little one. Actually, I think that's enough now. We were complaining that we didn't have enough, and they finally brought them in. But we're here to talk about this very thing. And actually, we've expanded it just as we've even started. There's those relationships between intimate and caring couples. There's those family relationships. There's those parental, there's those grandparental relationships. And you guys have done everywhere, been everything, and really decided to look at it. That's actually my first curiosity. What led you? What's some of that early history? And I know there's a beautiful early chapter, and we've got a little excerpt of that in the magazine. So what led you to decide, let's look at this scientifically?
For me, it was really gross incompetence. So, I was terrible at relationships. I really went, before Julie, I went from one disaster to another. And the same thing was true for my best friend, Bob Levinson. And we started doing this research together in the mid-'70s. And we wanted to see if there were people who actually knew how to have good relationships. And we discovered that there are masters of relationships. And we compared them to people more like us, the disasters of relationships. And sure enough, they were really different.
And I came on the scene in the mid-'80s. John and I met then and married. And I was in private practice, Richard. I was working with very severely traumatized people, torture victims, war, combat survivors, and so on. I really loved my private practice, but every night, John and I would compare notes over dinner, which bored our daughter to tears, but, we had to do it anyway. And he would explain to me what his discoveries were of that day. And I might share a few little tidbits from, without identifying anybody, of the cases I was working with.
Mhm.
But you know what? I found his research really fascinating. And I tried to resist. I wanted to be, an individual, my own self, blah, 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 blah. Forget it. I loved his research. And so I joined him in the research and then eventually forming the Gottman Institute in the early 90s.
And such a formidable contribution to the literature, but from a relationship, sort of there was this partnership that
Right.
did the process. But it's interesting, John, as you say, that the disastrous way in which we cope with this interpersonal engagement. And
Right.
I mentioned to you before, I was an actor in my first learning experience to become a psychotherapist. And of course, not only did I have my own disasters, but constantly through the literature, it was all about disastrous relationships or impossible relationships, your Romeo and Juliet. There was this aspect of, but that love relationships, which of course, really on a societal level, are only fairly new. Relationships and marriages for many, many years were organized for social reasons and economic reasons and all kinds of different things. But this
Right.
love relationship. So when we talk about the new marriage clinic, I think it's really we've got 7 all that the 7 principles of making marriage work. we really are new to this experience this last few hundred years. And what are some of the things that really jumped out straight up, I suppose, really in your own learning, John?
Yeah, it was surprising because psychology at the time, Bob Levinson and I started studying relationships, really didn't include relationships. We had trouble getting our first papers even reviewed by a psychology journal. And Walter Mischel in 1968 had written a book called Personality and Assessment, where he said psychology is good at understanding human behavior, but only about 9% of the variation. Our best measures can account for 9% of the variation in human behavior. 91% is still error. And Michelle said, that's not much of a science. So we started studying couples. You know, the people who were considering us for tenure said, you're never going to discover anything. So we were completely shocked when 3 years after we saw our first 30 couples in our lab, we could account for changes in marital satisfaction, accounting for 90% of the variance, not 9%. So our measures were really very predictive of the future of a relationship. And of course, the people, again, evaluating for 10 years said, well, it's just chance. It'll never replicate. But it replicated 6 different times and throughout the entire life course. And I was interested in children, so I studied the effects of couple relationships on their children and children's effect on them. And Julie and I designed our first apartment lab where we studied 130 newlyweds, as many of them became parents for the first time, and studied the babies and their interaction with the parents. And all of these relationships replicated and were very powerful. But before Julie, we had no clue how to help anybody, but we needed her expertise.
Sweet.
That's we'll pay him the $20 later, but no, but it's a
It's
fascinating.
more than that, Richard.
It's worth more than that. But it's interesting that that beautiful interaction, the checking. I know my lovely wife Susie, we actually, which is quite funny, we'd be in cafes and we'd be, you know, arguing a paper. We're particularly interested in lifestyle medicine and some of the body work and things. And we'd be there, you know, saying, "Oh, I don't know, blah, 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 blah," and we'd be quite robust and active. And then, of course, we'd pause and say, "Would you like a cup of coffee now, darling?" People around us would find it quite interesting. So that aspect of relating, and it's many different elements, of many different ways in which a relationship is experienced, and it goes through. And I think we get them mixed up sometimes. I think that's some of the things that came up in some of your research. You know, what one is focusing on, the other one is focusing on something different. That mismatch between their intentions, that sort of stuff.
And when we started off, you know, therapists were thought to make relationships work, you had to create boundaries between partners, and that was the secret. They had to have these separate areas of life, otherwise the relationship wouldn't work. And they had to be able to say no to each other, to be individuals first, and then they could have a relationship. But that just turned out to be a myth. There were so many myths that really were not true, not supported by data.
Yeah, that pendulum swing from total dependence to total independence, and missing the space in between. Julie, what are you thinking there?
Well, I'm thinking about the misnomer of codependence. You know, it's one of the words that was used back then. It was adopted from actually the addiction treatment industry, which involved the partner of somebody who suffered from an addiction really helping to support that addiction inadvertently by, for example, calling the boss when their partner was hungover and unable to go to work and saying, "Oh, you know, they're just suffering from the flu. It's no big deal." So making excuses for the person who was addicted missing particular events that they were committed to. So that word codependence was then taken into relationships around this whole boundary defining treatment that had no scientific basis, and saying, oh, gee, you're being codependent if you want your needs to be met by your partner. Well, we're astonished by that because as I think about it, people are pack animals. We don't survive without depending on one another. We have to form social connections in which we enable one another to live fruitfully and for others to enrich our lives, right? With love, with appreciation, with respect, and so on. And it's also a challenge, to sustain the positive environment that you have in a connection. But we call that interdependence, not codependence. But codependence had a bad rap. And therefore, you weren't supposed to be dependent on anyone back then. And we beg to differ, and all our data suggested that as well.
And there's a Western worldliness to some of this as well, and then there's other interesting cultural frameworks. I mean, there was a big experiment, I suppose. We sometimes talk the American experiment, but I think it sort of broadens out to places like mine, Australia. But of the individual, of the solipsism. I mean, I'm always encouraged when people say, what's the truth about my independence? And mirror neurons to me are just the single one. I can say, well, we've got neurons that fire in their head as if I'm doing what you're doing when I'm watching you. Sorry, we're absolutely connected and meant to be. Then there were, I mean, one of my favorite books, Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language by Robin Dunbar back in the 90s. Just talking about this importance of the naturalness of interrelationship, of interconnection. Of course, interpersonal neurobiology, Dan Siegel taking a big strong point there. But a lot of this stuff is bouncing off and around and parallel to the work you were doing all along that way, the 80s, 90s, and through. So just a little bit more about this this nature of how we play in with each other as, I mean, we're separate entities. We can tell by our skin and our thinking, but we're not. Can we just expand that a little more, and how we achieve that in a relationship where there's so many? I mean, you're there at the worst of times. That's one of our biggest difficulties as well. Sorry, a bit of a laden conversation there. Respond to whatever you want.
Yeah, I think you're right, Richard. One of the ways we think about relationships is that it's kind of like two musicians who get together, and really make music together. The music is a third thing. It's not either one of them. It's something they groove together and create. In the same way, a relationship is a kind of structure and time that people create. And the masters of relationships are really careful at being gentle with one another, at being appreciative of one another, being kind, empathetic to one another, and really nurturing that connection. So the music is really harmonious in a lot of ways. Not that there is always perfect connection, because repair is really an important part of what makes the masters different. They try to repair and they're successful at it when they miscommunicate. So it's really a third thing that the relationship is. And if we take a look at that, what the relationship is beyond each personality that's creating it, we can really describe it. It has stability, and we know how to nurture it and how to improve it and how to avoid disaster as well through this collaboration between a clinician who really was working with the worst possible cases in the world and a therapist who dated the worst possible people in the world.
Thank you for not including me, honey.
As
Before I met
previously
her.
dated.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
previously. There
This
was
is BJ before Julie.
Before
Yeah.
Julie.
Julie. There was a really interesting. I've kind of changed the line up from a film called Meet Joe Black, and he was sort of deaf, coming back into the world to try and discover what love is. He fell in love, and he was sort of quizzing someone, and I have changed the line a little bit, but essentially what this character, who was one of the weaker characters in the film, but he seemed to have the best sort of relationship, and he said, "What is love? Why do you get on? What's successful about your relationship?"
Hmm.
And he more or less said, "She knows the worst of me and loves me anyway."
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
Sure.
this acceptance, Julie, this like yeah, John, you stuffed up a whole bunch of relationships before me, but somehow that was okay. Uh, how did you personally do it, and how does that find that you became an example of the therapy of the scientific research you were doing?
Well, actually, Richard, I have to say that we're both a negative example and a positive example. Right. So we've made, every mistake there is. And some of our interventions actually come from some of those mistakes. But basically, all of us, when we first enter into limerence, which is that, initial stage of attraction to somebody that is related to pheromones, what we call chemistry, um, uh, that easy rapport that we may have with somebody. And when we're first meeting somebody, we're often on our best behavior, right? So we're hiding out the parts of us that we may not like in ourselves, and we assume nobody else will like either. But then, as we come to live together, perhaps, and then we exude certain gases at night. We may chew with our mouth open, all these lovely habits, right? That make us human beings, that make us multifaceted. We begin to see after a year or two of living together where that best behavior begins to drop off and the real person surfaces. And that real person is not perfect by a long shot. They're not ideals. They will often make mistakes. They may forget things that are really important to us, like, our anniversary or something. And um, there's a lot of acceptance and also knowing that we ourselves are full of flaws. We are full of cracks. So if we sit back and judge our partner as insufficient or inadequate or incompetent or, whatever, not as smart as we are, if we're really judgmental or contemptuous, we are really missing a very important factor, which is the flaws in ourselves that they are having to accept, right? So, one of the things that John and I have really been talking about a lot as we go into our senior years, we're long in them, is gratitude for the wonderful things that our partners bring to that relationship. And in focusing on gratitude and what our partners are doing right rather than what they're doing wrong, we find that all the things they're doing right typically far outweigh the little things that they may be slipping up on. And one of the exercises I use for myself, because I treat cancer patients and their families, is thinking, okay, what would my life be like if he was gone, fully gone? He was underground. What would my life be like? How would I feel? Who would I have breakfast with? Who would I argue politics with? you know, who would I share a fabulous new restaurant with? And, the loneliness that I would experience, which I imagine is overwhelming. And that brings me about into the circle of acceptance and gratitude for the incredible gifts that this man brings into my life that I could never duplicate with anyone else.
Yeah, it's
And this
mutual.
is, yeah, and this is, that's beautiful, John. Yeah, and this is the sort of, particularly the new marriage clinic, you know, these sorts of practical, applicable sort of exercises and activities are what we give, what you're giving to the therapist, and that certainly is one I must admit with myself. Now, being a later marriage. I think of all the terrible things that have happened to me in my earlier times, defrauded out of all my money, you know, acting career failing, going to all
Ooh.
these things. And I think if I hadn't done those, I wouldn't have gone down the pathway that I'm going. I wouldn't have met Susie. And I go back, they were all worth it.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting thing to do retrospectively from an older
Mm-hmm.
age.
Mm-hmm.
Those younger people coming through, one of the things I hear from young relationships is, I'm worried what I've sacrificed. I'm wondering what I have missed because I've fallen in love with this person. Do you have any thoughts and contributions to that difficulty of the younger relationship compared to that older relationship?
Yes. First of all, it's really important to know that came out of John's research, very important finding, that 69% of all the conflicts that couples struggle with are perpetual problems. They never, ever go away, right? They're based on either personality differences or differences in lifestyle preference. So, what that means is okay, you've fallen in love with George. George is fabulous. However, what about Bill over there? Isn't Bill cool? Because I've got this struggle with George where I'm extroverted, he's introverted. And how do we go to parties together? It's hard to socialize. And that is one of those classic perpetual problems that consist, in 69% of the conflicts you'll have with somebody. So if I think about, okay, well, what if I was with Bill? Well, Bill is extroverted like I am. How wonderful. But he always drinks, like 5 glasses of vodka every time we go out, which is 3 times a week. Uh-oh, I wonder if there's a problem there. Meanwhile, there's also Sam over there or Zelda over there who's never held a job in their life, right? And so I'm expected to support them and they're never going to go out and look for a job. How's that going to feel? So you see, with every single choice we make, we're not only making a choice of kind of the ideal characteristics in these different individuals, we're also choosing the perpetual problems we're going to have for the rest of our lives. So you have to be realistic about actual sacrifice or actually maybe not.
Yeah.
Let me offer a different metaphor. Maybe this is a switch, but I decided a year ago to learn how to play the violin, and I have a great teacher. And I'm better off. I'm better at playing the violin now than I was a year ago. I'm still not a good violinist, but I have a teacher. But in relationships, where are the teachers? And where's the knowledge that allows us to become really good violinists if we practice and work at it? Where do we get the information to make relationships sing in the best way they can? How do we get the best relationship? We don't have a manual. And that was the purpose of the research, was really to unearth whether there were principles that made relationships work and whether they really were consistent over time and universal. And it seems like they are.
Mm-hmm.
And that enabled Julie and I to create this sound relationship house theory. which really is the basis of all of our therapy.
Yeah, let me add to that, if I may, Richard.
Please do.
Yeah. So one of the things that, there'd been very little research, maybe 5 studies, 7 studies, something like that, on what makes relationships work. And they were actually retroactive as opposed to predictive. So John and Bob Levinson were the first ones to do these predictive studies that actually were successful. But what they did was study not only the couples who were failing, but the couples who were succeeding. And from the couples who were succeeding, we deduced, that's how you have a successful relationship. So studying them 100th of a second by 100th of a second as they were having conversations and looking at what was going on emotionally, what was going on verbally, non-verbally, what was going on physiologically in both unsuccessful versus successful couples, we could really see, that's what they're doing that's different. And in the new marriage clinic, which is 20 years after the first marriage clinic book that was produced, we had really gone deeply into all the interventions that those successful couples taught us. We didn't invent those. They didn't come out of thin air. They came out of really observing very closely what successful couples were doing and then following them for as long as 20 years to make sure, yep, they really are successful. They're still together 20 years later. So that was one thing that was very unusual about John and Bob's research. They looked at the people who were doing it right, not only the people who were failing.
And
Yeah,
this
but
is
it could still have just been correlation. I mean, we needed to show that actually, if we taught the disasters to act like the masters, that the relationship would change. Could we prevent disaster? And that's been the last 27 years of research for Julie and I to show that these are causal relationships, that we can make a difference and we can solve very difficult problems.
Yeah, and I think that this is the value for, and of course, a lot of people listening here will be therapists, but also we have individuals as well. But for the therapist, it's looking for what to recognize, which is actually fits in with a lot of my work, what I call client responsiveness, which I'm trying to get a better understanding now. What to be responsive to when you're sitting in the therapy room with your couple and they're saying something, you need to know stuff.
Right.
And the difficulty is you may be not very good at, your relationship might be having difficulty as a therapist, and so you're not a very good guide for yourself. And that I think has been the enormous value. I've seen people who are terrible, not very good in relationships in themselves or learning in relationships of themselves, but they've been able to look at your material and go, oh yeah, but I understand what's good. I can't do it myself, but I'll help others do it. It's an interesting sort of, mixture of things that occurs with us as therapists. And I have quite a few therapists who say, oh, I don't do couples therapy. I find it too difficult. And I think that's, I think it's wise if they think that, is to not impose themselves. But it's just lack of knowledge. And I always recommend your books. And that's always the first step. But one of the things I just wanted to touch on a little bit is when things go disastrously wrong, because we try and find what makes it go right and how to improve. But when it's disastrously wrong, as you're saying, like there's addictions and you become real cover-ups for each other, domestic violence, where people become embedded and caught up in a totally sort of negative type of relationship,
or
binding.
affairs where they've shattered trust.
Shattered trust and affairs. Just talking broadly or specifically, however feels comfortable for you, about those, the research you've done on and what you can advise therapists working with those very, very difficult cases.
Okay, so for domestic violence, we actually did, let's see, how long was the study? 9 years or something? We did a treatment study.
Well, the 9-year study was
Right,
before intervention.
Right. So we did a treatment study of domestically violent couples. But it was very important to look at former research and to underscore that, which is there's two types of domestic violence. There's what we call characterological domestic violence and situational domestic violence. Characterological domestic violence is where there is a clear perpetrator, a clear victim. The victim can do nothing to stop the violence. The violence is very severe, causing major injuries, or weapons may be used as well, especially in the United States, as you might guess. And it's used as a method of control. It instills fear in the victim so that the victim won't leave. But the real object of the perpetrator is to have power and to experience their own power. Situational domestic violence is very different. First of all, it's minor domestic violence. It might be a slap, a push, maybe a kick, but not one that's really injurious to the other person. Both partners are domestically violent. It's not just one, it's both. Typically, it's symmetrical. And finally, both partners feel terrible about it. They really want it to change, and they take responsibility for it. And what we theorized was that it was the result of two factors, that situational domestic violence. One was escalated quarrels in which both people would get flooded, meaning physiologically they would go into fight or flight. And when you're in a state like that, mentally, you cannot think straight, you cannot listen well, you cannot creatively problem solve. Your prefrontal cortex is offline. And so all you're doing is believing that you're facing a saber-toothed tiger and you better attack back. The second factor is that they don't have a withdrawal ritual. They don't have a way to withdraw from the conflict when they're getting flooded and take a time out in order to self-soothe, calm down, to where that prefrontal cortex comes back online so that they can again talk with one another. And perhaps a third factor that I should add is that they don't have the skills. They don't have any idea of how to do conflict right. And there are right ways. We just gave a TED talk on it, in fact.
And they don't have any way to do intimacy right as well.
Right.
Friendship and intimacy.
And this is one thing you talk about, how to argue right, how to do intimacy right.
That's right. That's right.
There's a lack of preparedness in relationships to experiment, to make mistakes, to have a go and fail. And I think your books help with that. John, what do you find about this perfectionist thing, or Julie? What do you think?
Well, Richard, let me just, if you don't mind, just a little tangent. I wanted to tell you about the successful treatment study we did.
Oh, please.
So, yes. So we had groups of couples, small groups of couples that met with two facilitators. And those two facilitators showed those couples some films that we had made in a TV studio of mostly myself talking to domestically violent couples about the ways they changed their domestic violence or coped with getting flooded, etc. And there were 20 modules that we created based on those little film snippets that were edited down to 10 minutes. So these groups of 5 or 6, maybe 7 couples would meet once a week for 2 hours. They'd watch a film for about 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. They would discuss it between themselves without the facilitators giving them any big answers or telling them what to do, because most of these people were people in poverty who really didn't want to be in a classroom, didn't want to hear lectures by somebody. So we knew that they would come back to the groups week after week only if they made a connection with one another and created a little community of couples. And so they would discuss the film they saw for about 30, 40 minutes. And then one of the facilitators would give them a short little teaching, maybe 15 minutes long at the most, and why a particular skill or understanding was so important, and then give them an exercise to do, mostly with their partner privately or in the corners of the room, to practice that particular skill. And the other thing that we added was a little biofeedback device called the M-Wave, EMWAVE, created by a company called HeartMath. We do not have stock in that company, by the way, but we would give these couples the little biofeedback. Each one would have a biofeedback device to practice self-soothing for 5 minutes on this little device, just 5 minutes. And after 20 modules, 20 weeks, basically, of learning these skills and so on, the follow-up results, and then post-treatment, and then a year and a half later, showed the elimination of domestic violence, the elimination of most of the hostility, the increase in friendship, the increase in intimacy in these partners. It was the first real research-based treatment that had successfully treated situational domestic violence.
Compared to a control group.
Compared to a control group.
And the assessment wasn't just questionnaires. It was also filming the couple a year and a half after the interventions ended, having a conflict in their homes and measuring their physiology while they had the conflict in their homes. And there was no physiological arousal during conflict anymore. So very dramatic findings.
I was going, cortisol levels and various other.
Yeah, right. So we changed all of that, as well, even a year and a half after treatment ended.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been talking a lot with a lot of my colleagues is looking at capacities, looking at the client capacities, and thinking more in a systems way than a directly linear way. That it's actually that these capacities can go in a, you can take them in a very down the rabbit hole, unpleasant way. But if you know something, the same capacities can take you in a very positive way, and those major errors. I mean, it's amazing the strengths that such an exercise and an activity like saying would point out that have just been put in the background because of these negative or protective or defensive and all those other things that are happening.
Exactly.
Now that program is how would a therapist get engaged in learning or understanding or utilizing that program?
Well, it's called Couples Together Against Violence, CTAV. We've had a little bit of a challenge in the Gottman Institute of getting that out into the public arena or into the professional arena, really. But we have the materials all archived in the Gottman Institute's knowledge banks.
But I mean, we got to wait for things. I know I'm doing things. My lovely mentor Ernest Rossi, who passed in 2020, I'm doing things that I know he would be saying, "Oh, good, that's new. Why aren't I involved?" Oh, that's right, I'm not here. But of course, there are many other courses and things. I mean, I see this coming up, the Gottman style. So there are a variety of these ways of learning that are available for
That's
therapists,
right.
Mm-hmm.
and they're around the world usually. Or how do you find? Do you find this? You teach people and they become teachers. Is that the ways that you're doing things?
Oh, our model is that we developed a professional clinical training program that has 4 levels. Level 1, 2, 3, and level 4 is consultation. Um, and then people have to, if they want to be certified in our methods, they will undergo a certain number of hours of that consultation and then present videotapes to be reviewed by our master trainers and reviewers. And if they pass muster, I think there are like 6 of them that are required, then people can call themselves a certified Gottman therapist.
Well, that's very encouraging. So when you see an advertisement for a certified authorized Gottman therapist thing, you're getting someone who really knows what they're doing from your point of view. That's wonderful to know.
Right. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And now we've sort of coming towards the end of the interview, just because podcasts do that. I'd love to talk to you for the next week or so, but I guess that's not allowed. But I mean, is there a question I've missed? Is there something you particularly want to say? I mean, sort of everybody go, the New Marriage Clinic is a great book to get out there. I love Dan Siegel saying it's fun and funny, reminding us that therapy is not this deathly serious thing. But what would you like to do? Or perhaps just a roundup of the
Well,
session?
one thing I'd like to say is that there's this TV show called Couples Therapy, and it's in its 2nd season now. And the therapist just starts talking to the couple, not knowing a thing about them. And what we really bring to this field is that assessment has to precede intervention. And you need to know what the strengths of the couple are, as well as their challenges and their history and their previous relationships and their childhood. So you need to do a very thorough assessment of the relationship and know its strength and its challenges before you intervene. And then the intervention can be really targeted and give feedback to the therapist about their progress along these dimensions of building social skill and developing closer intimacy and developing trust and commitment as well.
And to add to that, we've now created a software platform that you can either do with couples in your office, or couples can actually do it at home. And the software content guides the couple through all the steps of assessment, and if they want, including the actual research methods that come right out of John's lab and have all been folded into a set of algorithms that within seconds gives the therapist a whole readout assessment of those strengths and challenges and recommendations for what kind of interventions are needed for that particular couple.
And Julie and I created 37 video modules that people can access on their phones to really improve in those challenge areas.
Yeah, that's right.
So wonderful. I'm just thinking of Fiddler on the Roof and that wonderful song, Do You Love Me? And it says, after 35 years of doing this and doing this.
Only 25, Richard. 25.
25. Oh, I've extended there. That's because I'm getting older. But what's interesting is we don't have to spend 25 years figuring out how to get a good relationship. We can actually, but you've broached this wonderful misunderstanding that relationships are easy because they've just been something people have done, but also broached the nature that relationships are complex and fun and enjoyable, and bringing yourselves into somebody else's life is an absolutely extraordinary experience. And we shouldn't mess it up by getting overwhelmed by the crankiness. And you've been a relationship in my life, albeit from a distance. And I'm so pleased to have had the opportunity to personalize it now. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you, Richard.
thank you, Richard. That's really
It's a
kind.
great interview. Thank you so much.
And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you and your audience. Thanks. You're doing a service.
Well, it's my great pleasure, and what else do we have to do but be of service? Anyway, for now, Julie and John Gottman, I just thank you so much for your time, your energy, not just in this interview, but of course for the last decades of extraordinary work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.